Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have a review of Agatha Christie's standalone novel, Toward Zero, also called Come and Be Hanged, both of which are very good titles. And this book is celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2024, and this is definitely considered one of the best Christie titles out there, and I firmly agree. I mean, the main hero is the seldom used Superintendent Battle, who always leaves me wanting more, but I do like him better than Colonel Race. This is actually the last Battle novel to be written, and I don't know why Christie retired him over 30 years before she stopped writing, but I'm not going to complain about that. And like I said, this is widely considered one of the most iconic Christie novels, and that is praise that largely holds up. I'll get more into it later, but I love what Christie does with this book. Yes, plot wise, but mostly in her commentary about mystery novels. This is a mystery novel that is subtextually, actually, not even, as it is directly brought up about mystery novels and Christie's belief and philosophy about the genre she mastered, because I largely agree with her philosophy. And just as a reminder, the way I review my works is that I will start off with a spoiler free summary mixed with commentary up until the point the murderer is revealed, at which I will warn you spoilers are coming so you can back out if need be. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Toward Zero begins with one of my favorite styles of openings where we spend some seemingly insignificant moments with most of the characters, and this is such an appropriate opening for this book in particular, given the theme. And these events take place over the course of a few months leading up to the main murder plot. Something to note here is that the beginning sections are presented as a series of events, one after another, that makes summarizing them awkward and clunky, even though it does not read that way, at least mostly. We start with the elderly Mr. Treves, who is discussing this sensational murder trial and complains about mystery novels that begin with the murder when they should end with the murder. He says all of the interesting things that lead up to the murder is the real plot, and the murder is the culmination of all of those events. And boy, do we need Mr. Treves now. I am not a big fan of this sort of like new style of mysteries that insists the murder has to be in the first chapter. I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the mystery genre, and it delegates it to nothing more than like a silly little genre not to be taken seriously. Mr. Treves has it right, and so does Christie. The first murder does not happen until very late in this book. Christie writes Toward Zero in the way Mr. Treves wants a book to be written. We then go on to Angus MacWhirter, who is in the hospital, and he's pretty angry to be alive. He attempted to commit suicide by jumping off of a cliff, but was saved by a tree and a passing couple. He is not happy with his nurse, but she just takes it on the chin. He gets into a one-sided argument with her about like how dumb it is to treat him because he's just going to try to kill himself again. But the nurse says he won't do that because suicides who survive such a dramatic attempt never try again. And most crucially, Angus MacWhirter might be needed in some situation in the future. We then jump into an unidentified person planning a murder plot on paper, but then rips it up and burns it so it only exists in their mind. And this should put us on notice pretty early on that this murder is premeditated and requires a lot of planning, although, of course, Christie has a way of tricking us with this. We then go to Superintendent Battle, our main detective in this book. I never particularly liked Battle. I always thought he was fine, but he never really stands out to me. And this is probably his best book, both in terms of plot and of character. Battle's teenage daughter Sylvia has confessed to petty thefts at her school, but one look at her and Battle knows his daughter is innocent, and she just confessed to end the interrogation and the mental torture that was coming along with it. He goes as far as to be able to identify the real thief by just glancing at her smug face. We then go to Neville Strange, a famous tennis star, and his second wife, Kay. They are in the midst of a disagreement because Kay wants to go away with some friends in August, but can't because Neville insists they have to travel to Gull's Point to visit Lady Tressilian, who is the widow of Neville's benefactor. Kay does not like Gull's Point because all the people there hate her and prefer Neville's first wife, Audrey. And to me, this reminded me a lot of Rebecca, with the perfect first wife and no one really accepting the second wife. But Neville wants Audrey and Kay to be friends and claims Audrey is up to the idea because, after all, she agreed to divorce Neville so he could marry Kay. Meanwhile, Lady Tressilian is angered by all of this because she thinks divorce is inappropriate, and never mind having the wives reconcile. She doesn't even believe Audrey when Audrey tells her that she's fine with this. And with Lady Tressilian suspecting something is up, and even go as far as to accuse Mary Aldin, her poor relation stuck taking care of the old lady, of having a hand in it. Lady Tressilian is starting to lose her mind a little bit here, a little paranoid. And then we go to Malaya, where Thomas Royde mentions to his friend that he is traveling back to England after a 6-year absence because he's learned that Audrey has divorced Neville, with the implication that he is interested in Audrey. He also mentions that his brother Adrian died a few years back in a car accident. And, whenever a death is mentioned in a Christie novel, you should make note of it, even in passing, even if it was an accident or a natural death, or perhaps it wasn't. We go back to Neville and Kay, where Neville graciously loses a tennis tournament because his opponent took advantage of his weak forehand. Ted Latimer, a friend of Kay's, is in attendance and says the reason why Neville never wins is because he's too nice. Previously, the narration mentioned Neville never wins a tournament because he's good at all sports and doesn't focus enough on tennis. Neville is clearly jealous of Kay's friendship with Ted, even though he claims not to be because he married Kay, and he knew it was fate because of the way they came across each other in the Riviera. However, Kay says that she actually planned their spontaneous meeting because she was a fan of Neville and wanted to meet him. It wasn't fate as Neville thought it was. We finally arrive at Gull's Point when Thomas Royde arrives at the train station. Mary Aldin picks him up, and she seems very relieved to have him, as he's a stranger, sort of stranger. He's not a stranger to Audrey, and everyone else, sort of knows him, but Mary hopes his presence will calm the tide and tension that is brewing between all these different parties that have assembled at Gull's Point. Unfortunately, this doesn't work on Mary herself, who is jealous of the attention Thomas is giving Audrey. Kay and Neville get into a tiff because both she and Audrey wanted a magazine, but Neville gave that magazine to Audrey, and Neville repeatedly insults Kay by calling her a child. Lady Tressilian is actually enjoying herself, despite the tension, because Neville is unhappy and miserable, and she thinks he deserves this for bringing both Audrey and Kay. Lady Tressilian throws a little get-together and invites her old friend, Mr. Treves, whom she hadn't seen for many years, and Ted Latimer, so Kay has some company. And that goes just as bad as the previous events, because Kay and Ted dance together, which forces Neville and Audrey to dance together. There's also a moment where Audrey loses an earring under the table, and during the search, she gets her hair caught in Neville's cufflink. The conversation turns to murder, as it often does in Agatha Christie house parties. Mr. Treves tells a story about a child murderer he knew, and although that child has a different name now and is an adult, Mr. Treves would still recognize that child because of a distinctive physical feature that child had. And if you think this is going to play a major part in solving the mystery, you'd be right. Unfortunately, every character in this book has an unusual physical feature, so it's not going to help you narrow it down any. Ted Latimer walks Mr. Treves back to his hotel, where they see an out-of-order sign on the elevator, and this forces Mr. Treves to take the stairs. Thomas Royde is also with them. The next day, all hell breaks loose. Mary Aldin is a mess, and she just can't wait for everyone to go back from where they came. Audrey is distraught and depressed. She actually visits the same place where Angus MacWhirter tried to commit suicide, also implying that she may be thinking about it. Thomas Royde professes his love for Audrey, but she turns him down. Neville actually refers to Audrey as his wife, and seemingly wants to reconcile with her. Audrey rejects that as well, and Kay overhears this. Kay gets very angry with Neville and refuses to divorce him, even goes as far as to vow to kill him before she will grant him a divorce. Lady Tressilian is upset because Mr. Treves died suddenly, And what happened to him was that he had a bad heart and apparently had a heart attack caused by having to walk up the hotel stairs because the elevator was out of order. Only Mary Aldin and Thomas Royde learned that the elevator wasn't actually out of order despite there being the sign on it, so that's a little weird. A storm comes in one night, and Neville decides that's a good time to play billiards with Ted Latimer at his hotel and decides to walk there in the rain. The same night, Lady Tressilian is found murdered by one of the maids. This happens just past the halfway point of this book, so you can see all of the events that lead up to the murder forming the main story and culminating in the murder of Lady Tressilian. At least that's what we think initially. And this is what Mr. Treves was advocating for at the beginning of the story. Bennett, who is the servant who attends to Lady Tressilian, was drugged and passed out, but she's alive. Superintendent Battle is called into the case because he's vacationing with his nephew, James Leach, who is also a police inspector. I think there's like an off chance Leach is also Colin Lamb from the Clocks. I would lean no, but it is possible. We're told Colin Lamb, we're not told, we're implied to us that Colin Lamb is actually like Superintendent Battle's son, but it could be his nephew, so this is a possibility. But anyway, Lady Tressilian was bludgeoned to death, and the crime scene is a little unusual. There is a bloody golf club found at the scene, but it doesn't really match the wounds on her head unless the club was held at an unusual angle. It also appears she was hit by a left-handed person or from an unusual angle because her bedroom is crowded and there isn't a lot of room to like swing the golf club in the manner one would typically do so. Neville is the very clear prime suspect. It was his golf club, his fingerprints are all over it, and he was heard arguing with Lady Tressilian before her death. And he inherits money from her via her late husband Matthew. A bloody and wet blue suit of his is also found in his bedroom. Leach and Battle, however, find this almost too obvious, and that if Neville really did murder Lady Tressilian, he was an idiot to leave like all of this incriminating evidence behind. Moreover, the drugging of the maid suggests premeditation, while the Neville theory would have to be spur of the moment. Even more so, Neville is known as a very even-tempered man. He never gets angry, as we saw in his tennis matches, so he was unlikely to have lost his mind and killed Lady Tressilian in a rage. Battle suspects Neville is being framed by someone. Neville begins to panic when he learns he is being suspected. He admitted to arguing with Lady Tressilian, but said he didn't murder her, as they always argued all the time. Lady Tressilian was always criticizing Neville, and moreover, Neville doesn't need the money he inherited. Neville said he took the ferry across, and then he walked over to Ted Latimer's hotel where they played billiards until Latimer drove him home around 1 a.m. He also did not wear the blue suit because it was raining, so he wore a gray pinstripe suit because he didn't care if that one got wet and ruined. Battle and his nephew interview everyone else where we don't really learn anything new. Kay is insistent Audrey set this whole thing up to get back with Neville. Mary Aldin inherits some money from Lady Tressilian, but it's not really worth killing over. Battle recognizes Audrey is sullen and can't quite put his finger on what is going on with her, but he knows something is strange here. And Ted Latimer confirms Neville's story. Battle and his nephew are pretty resigned to the fact that they have to arrest Neville Strange. The evidence is overwhelming if a bit obvious, and they can't really hold off any longer. They have an uneasy feeling until the maid Barrett comes to and reveals that she saw Lady Tressilian alive after her argument with Neville. And this is all Battle needs to firmly believe Neville is being framed. Battle is forced to focus on which other person could have done it, and he leans toward Ted Latimer, but Ted Latimer has an alibi. Mary Aldin tells him about the story Mr. Treves told about the child killer, which leaves Battle to believe he was murdered, even though that murder seems really ridiculous to pull off. It doesn't seem like anyone is a likely murderer. Everyone mostly has a motive, but most interestingly, Lady Tressilian's will, via her late husband Matthew, splits the estate between Neville and Audrey. We were told multiple times that the will leaves the estate to Neville and his wife, with the implication that it was his current wife. But no, Audrey is named in the will, which is something that she knew, but Kay apparently did not. We then catch up with Angus MacWhirter after a while, and he is back in the area months after his suicide attempt. He is no longer suicidal, as the nurse predicted, but he's not really any happier with his new job he's going to take in South America. A young girl approaches him with a very smelly dog he gives a bath to. And the dog smells like rotting fish because he entered a crevice in the rocks, and that same smell appears on a suit MacWhirter wanted dry cleaned, but he never got done. Ted Latimer also noticed a bad smell in his hotel. This suit, however, is not actually Angus MacWhirter's suit. There was a mix up at the dry cleaners, and they gave him the wrong suit. This one is a dark blue suit that has like an odd pattern on the shoulder. MacWhirter returns to the very cliff he jumped off of and prevents Audrey from doing the same. Audrey is very clearly afraid of being hanged, implying that she is now the prime suspect and the police are honing in on her. And this sort of like comes out a little out of nowhere, but Battle was working on the assumption that Neville was being framed, but never gave any like real indication he was suspecting Audrey. And although Battle takes a note from his old friend Hercule Poirot, who gets name dropped quite a few times in this novel, he notices one of the knobs on Lady Tressilian's bedpost is cleaner than the other, and deduces that that must actually be the murder weapon. Indeed, he finds this like weird device of a tennis racket outfitted with the knob that much better fits the murder weapon description than a golf club. Audrey's gloves were also found in the bushes nearby. Angus MacWhirter vows to get involved because he believes Audrey is innocent and doesn't want her hanged for a crime she didn't commit. He asks Mary Aldin for a rope, which she finds odd, but she brings him to the shack where there is indeed a rope that is wet and clean despite everything else in the shed being dusty. And this rope also smells like rotting fish. Battle is ready to arrest Audrey because the tennis racket is hers, the gloves have blood on them, and she has a motive to frame Neville since he left her for Kay. However, Thomas Royde drops a bombshell here that while Audrey did indeed file for divorce from Neville, it wasn't out of kindness so Neville could marry Kay, as we've been told repeatedly in this novel. It was because Audrey wanted to marry Adrian Royde, Thomas's brother who died in the car accident shortly afterward. Neville begrudgingly admits this. So now Battle is all confused because it would appear someone was framing both Neville and Audrey, and that doesn't really make any sense. Moreover, Audrey actually does confess and says it's a relief she's finally been caught. And this is how Battle knows she's innocent and that she's lying. She had the exact same look on her face that Battle's daughter Sylvia had when she confessed to those thefts earlier in the novel. She just wanted the stress over with. But now, Battle is totally clueless until Angus MacWhirter comes to him with some information. And this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so the 0 hour approaches, so back out now if you don't want this book spoiled. You've been warned, there are spoilers for the rest of the video. Angus MacWhirter reveals his information to Battle, although the reader is not privy to this, and I would still consider this fair play. Even though we are not told what this information is before time, we could figure out from the clues provided. We don't need it told to us. I challenge anyone to actually figure it out, but it is possible. MacWhirter says he saw someone climbing a rope up the cliff to Gull Point, and we know that Lady Tressilian's bedroom and some of the other bedrooms overlooked a steep drop, so this is the only way to reach her window from the outside. This means the murderer was someone outside of the house at the time, so either Neville Strange, Thomas Royde, or Ted Latimer. And Battle accuses Neville because the murderer had to have taken the ferry across the way, but then swim back to climb up the rope. Ted Latimer cannot swim, as he demonstrated when Battle pushes him off of a boat, and Thomas Royde also cannot climb a rope because he has a bad arm. That's his odd physical his physical feature. It has to be Neville who framed himself for the murder in such a way that it looked like a frame up by Audrey. The 0 hour, that moment Mr. Treves described where all the events of the past several months culminate at one specific point. The 0 hour is not the murder of Lady Tressilian, but the murder of Audrey Strange via the humiliation from hanging for a murder she did not commit. Neville denies this, but breaks down when Battle really lets him have it with some psychological torture. The murder reveal in Towards Zero is one of the best, if not the best, in all of Christie, Neville has a complete breakdown, and that calm, nice guy demeanor goes completely out the window. The mask comes off, and the real Neville is exposed as this vindictive, insane, inhuman creature. He murdered Lady Tressilian not because he wanted the money or because he hated her, but because he wanted to frame Audrey for the murder, get her hanged as revenge for leaving him for Adrian Royde. He planned this months in advance. One of the opening passages of our unnamed killer planning this murder, and when you look at that situation, just logically, it could only be Neville. There was a lot of talk about how inappropriate it was for Audrey and Kay to visit at the same time, and although Neville insisted it was his idea, everyone just thought Audrey was manipulating him into doing so. But no, this is a classic Christie trick. The truth was exactly what we were told the whole time. Neville arranged this so Audrey would be in on the scene when he murdered Lady Tressilian. This is how Neville did it. After arguing with Lady Tressilian, Neville made sure he was seen leaving the house. He then rang Lady Tressilian's bell from outside to summon the aide. This provided an alibi as Barrett had now seen Lady Tressilian alive after Neville left. He then took the ferry across the way, but instead of going toward Ted Latimer's hotel, he backtracked and swam across back to Gull Point, where he climbed up the rope into his bedroom, changed into his blue suit, murdered Lady Tressilian, changed out of his suit and back down the rope, and swam across the way and headed to Ted Latimer's hotel. Unfortunately for Neville, the gray pinstripe suit he took off to swim, he placed it in a crevice that had rotting fish, so it smelled, and Ted Latimer noticed this. Neville sent the suit to be dry cleaned, but didn't want to use his real name. He used a name that he saw in the hotel registry, which just happened to be Angus MacWhirter. And normally I don't like coincidences, but this one at least makes sense, given that we were told Angus MacWhirter survived his suicide attempt for a specific purpose. And it's a very strange case of a coincidence sort of like not coming out of nowhere. Audrey goes to see MacWhirter to thank him for saving her life, and he admits that he did it purely out of love, and it didn't matter if she was a murderess or not because he loves her. Oh, and he didn't actually see a man climbing up the rope like he claimed to. He surmised that is what must have happened, so he told Battle he saw it, even though he really didn't. Audrey and Angus are going to get married, which is very weird because they barely know each other. Their relationship felt very shoehorned in there. I could have done without it. It also ends in a very weird tone where MacWhirter says he's not going to let Audrey escape his clutches. It's weird. I don't think it's supposed to be chauvinistic, but it certainly comes across that way. I think it's just like an unfortunate choice of language rather than like another sort of meaning here. Like, I don't think this is as bad as like, Taken at the Flood or The Man in the Brown Suit or something like that. It's weird, but again, I don't think it's supposed to be like negatively toned or anything. It would have made more sense for Audrey to marry Thomas Royde, but Thomas is going to marry Mary Aldin, at least according to what Audrey thinks. It's also implied Kay will eventually marry Ted Latimer. And to wrap up a few loose ends here, Battle suspects, but cannot prove, Neville murdered Mr. Treves by putting that out of order sign on the elevator door, so he takes the stairs and has a heart attack. This is not believable at all. I think the murder of Mr. Treves is probably one of the least convincing in all of Christie. The reason Neville killed Mr. Treves is because Neville is allegedly the child in Mr. Treves' child murderer story. Battle also speculates Neville might have killed Adrian Royde with his car as an attempt to get Audrey back with him, but that one is even less secure. I'm going to discuss that possibility whenever I get around to making another video about Christie theories and unanswered questions, because there's even less evidence to support that claim than the Mr. Treves claim. It's really an open-ended question, but again, this is a very strong novel. I loved it even more this reread. Very good. If you haven't read it, you should read it, but you've been spoiled at this point. But again, you would still love this novel. I still do, knowing the solution. Moving into praise, I have so much to heap on this book. I'll start with Christie's philosophy. I wouldn't say this book is a manifesto for Christie, but she lays out in the opening pages via Mr. Treves exactly what her philosophy on mystery novels is. Christie expanded upon what mystery novels could do. Prior to Christie, they were formulaic and existed for no reason but to provide comfort to readers that the social order would be restored when it was broken. Christie set her books in a real place and time. They are commentaries about the time and place in which she lived. When Christie writes that the murder isn't the beginning of a mystery novel, it's the end, and all the events leading up to the murder are the real story. What she is saying is that murder mysteries aren't about the murder at all. They're about the people and society and all of these other things. The murder is symbolic, like how Bram Stoker's Dracula is symbolic of other things and isn't really truly about vampires. The vampires aren't the point of Dracula. And Christie not only talks the talk, but she delivers on this as well. And we are treated to a long sequence of lead up events to the murder that seemingly have nothing to do with anything, but eventually come into play. And this is genius craft work on Christie to be able to take all of these pieces and seamlessly make them relevant without forcing them in too much. But this is a philosophy and a style that is quickly disappearing from detective fiction. There's a trend nowadays that the murder needs to be in the first chapter, which I think is a flawed philosophy to have. It's also lazy, to be honest. Not that it can never happen, but when the murder is forced into the beginning, it feels it, and we often miss out on character development and all of these other things. I think it's flawed and, again, quite lazy to believe that the murder must be at the very beginning. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of detective fiction because it presupposes mystery novels are about the murder and not the overall big picture symbolized within the murder plot. And again, I don't mean to be overly critical of murder mysteries that do this because there are absolutely fantastic ones that have the murder right at the beginning. And there are some really great top tier murder mysteries that really just are about the murder and solving the plot. But oftentimes, when a murder appears in the beginning, they fail to achieve what they wanted to achieve. The best murder mysteries, like Toward Zero, both symbolize the bigger picture within the murder plot and have excellent plot mechanics. They execute on every front. And Toward Zero not only sets the standard philosophy wise, but it's also responsible for another standard I have regarding credibility. I always say I'm willing to forgive some credibility issues for the sake of clever mystery writing, but that has its limits. Toward Zero has an extremely convoluted, overly complicated murder plot that seems absolutely bonkers. No one would try this in real life, yet it is 100% credible that Neville Strange would develop this convoluted murder plot that involves climbing up ropes and moving around golf clubs and forging this weird tennis racket thing and having his suit dry cleaned and all that, not only to frame his ex-wife, but to frame her in a way that makes it look like she is framing him. Neville absolutely is that person. Christie is able to pull off both the zany mechanics and make it credible. It can be done. You don't need an either or. And I just think this plot is so deviously satisfying. It's a twist on the double bluff, framing the guilty party. The plot is genius. It's so satisfying and clever and solvable. All of the characters are wonderful. I'll talk more about them individually later. Angus MacWhirter may be a little less so, but he's not a flop. He's just kind of annoying, honestly. The setting is great. The geography plays a role in the solution, and Christie presents us with an interesting setting without bogging us down in boring geographic details. And overall, this is just a fun book. It's not one of those Christie novels that makes a larger point outside of the philosophy. It's a pretty standard mystery novel otherwise, and a very enjoyable one. I mean, this is top tier Christie for me. Now, this book is not perfect. The most glaring issue I have with it is the murder of Mr. Treves, which I would consider one of Christie's least convincing murders ever. I mean, Mr. Treves was allegedly murdered when Neville put out an out of order sign on his hotel elevator, forcing the elderly Mr. Treves to climb upstairs with his bad heart. He subsequently had a heart attack and died, and this just doesn't work for me. And I know there's short stories that feature similar plots, but I just don't buy this at all. And to be fair, it is lampshaded in the novel just how unlikely this is, but I also have problems with how Neville was able to get to the hotel before Mr. Treves and Ted Latimer did without being seen. The mechanics of this just don't work, and the motive makes sense because Mr. Treves recognized Neville as the kid who shot his friend with an arrow. And I also don't like that story of Mr. Treves, to be honest. It adds nothing to the novel because literally every suspect has a physical peculiarity about them, so you cannot solve the case based on that. It eliminates no one outright. I mean, I think what we're supposed to get from it is that it can't be Thomas Royde because Thomas Royde has the bad arm that he's had for a while, so he wouldn't be able to climb up the rope. But I mean, that's really stretching it, to be honest. And this whole plot involving Mr. Treves' death feels very forced into the novel, and I can't help but wonder if Christie, like so many current day authors, was told she needed to have a death earlier in the novel. Mr. Treves feels like a character Christie liked and would have preferred lived. I certainly get that sense anyway. There's so other like minor issues, but notable enough. I think the beginning of this story, when we're being treated to all those small snippets of events that lead up to and build up to the murder, may seem irrelevant to certain readers. This is not a Christie to read first. If you're not familiar with mysteries or Christie, I could easily see a reader like checking out here. And as much as I love this style of content, I do think some sections like really go on for a little too long. I know it sound contradictory here, but Christie makes her points about, like what Kay is like and what Neville is like, but then sort of like drags it on for a bit. I mean, some of the Neville Kay scenes are repetitive and they don't add much because we've already gotten the sense of who they are and we didn't really need to see more of the same thing. There's a little bit of coincidence in the solution. It's not a lot or enough to detract from the story, and most of it is explained convincingly enough. The Angus MacWhirter suit mix up, it does feel like a coincidence, but it's not because Devil did it on purpose. But overall, the positives far outweigh the negatives in this book. Moving on to characters, we'll start with our sleuth, Superintendent Battle. I believe this is the first time I get to talk about him alone, and he was good here. I'm not great. I've always liked Battle, but like never loved him. He comes off as slightly generic at times, but I think he's very effective in this book. Christie does not use either Poirot or Marple in this novel because those two become the stars of their novel, and this novel is about Neville and Audrey and Kay and everybody else. Battle is not the star of the novel. He is the hero, but not the main character. He's learned from Poirot. We can see this. He is a lot less of the conventional British detective in this book than he was in, like, Cards on the Table or, like, the Seven Dials mystery. The old Battle wouldn't have thought twice about arresting Audrey, but this Battle knows human nature a little more and is a little slower to arrest her. And he recognizes her innocence because his daughter Sylvia had the same look when she confessed to a crime she didn't commit out of sheer panic and terror. Battle is a lot more human here. We meet his family for the first time and his nephew. I wouldn't necessarily say Battle solved the murder, as that probably the credit goes more to Angus MacWhirter, but he is our hero and our main sleuth here. Our murderer is Neville Strange, and I ranked him number 6 on my list of 100 Christie killers, and I stick by that. Neville is one of the most devious killers in all of Christie. That opening passage of the unnamed murderer plotting his plan is so delicious, and the murderer like rips it up and burns it so it can't be found, and we're told it's all in that person's mind. This is one of the meanest plans in all of Christie. It's not just framing an innocent person, it's framing that innocent person in such a way as to create as much mental stress and despair on that person as possible. And that is even reflected in the alternate title of this book, Come and Be Hanged, sort of mocking Audrey that she's going to go to Gull's Point to be hanged. It's so evil. And this plot comes from Neville Strange, of all people, who is one of the kindest people around. I mean, much is made about how he never loses his temper when he loses a tennis match. We're told repeatedly that he will never win a championship because he's not aggressive enough at sports, and despite having all the skills and ability. And yet, when Neville is revealed as this brutal murderer, it is entirely believable. He has one of the most iconic breakdowns. He snaps. His persona comes out as this bitter, wicked man who masked all of that with this gentle exterior. He hates Audrey despite still loving her. He hates Kay. He's not a fan of Lady Tressilian. He kills Mr. Treves. He's such a ruthless person. He's so chilling when you reread this book because you can see through his act and the way he assists the police, so gently incriminating himself but looking so innocent and never hiding the most incriminating aspects of his personality. He buddies up to Ted Latimer, and the way he starts fights with Kay so she won't leave her room and she'll be angry with him and upset. He thought of everything, and his one mistake was checking that dry cleaning under Angus MacWhirter's name. I don't understand why he just didn't toss the suit somewhere, but Neville is just one of Christie's most iconic, most clever, evilest murderers out there, and he held up so well on this reread. Let's start with our victims now, getting into our first main victim, Lady Tressilian. She's a rare victim in Christie whose murder cannot be solved by analyzing her human nature. She's meaningless. She's a pawn in Neville's revenge game against Audrey. Lady Tressilian doesn't do anything to put herself in the position to get murdered, but yet she is still a well-developed character. Christie doesn't ignore her or treat her like a tool, and again, partially that's because the motive is obscured. She seems like a pretty unpleasant woman, but not downright awful. She's not in the jerk victim category, but she's very outspoken, and she's sort of right about Neville, but not in the way she proclaims. She's very upset about Neville bringing Kay to Gull's Point when Audrey's there, and this is so Christie can do her usual thing with these elderly people who are technically correct and wise, but Christie thinks young people should ignore them anyway. Lady Tressilian is correct that Neville shouldn't bring Kay when Audrey is there, but she thinks this for polite moral reasons. That's the wrong reasoning, is because Neville has other, more nefarious plans, and she seems largely unaware of Neville's true persona, although she does have disagreements with him and does sort of no, there's more to Neville than meets the eye. Lady Tressilian was a perfectly fine victim. I don't think she stands out in any way, but she has a pretty normal victim to me, especially for one whose human nature and character is irrelevant to the plot. Our other victim is Mr. Treves, and I talked a lot about his philosophy already, and that's really all he does in the novel. Again, I think his murder is not only very contrived and unconvincing, but also feels a little out of place. I think he added a lot to the story because of his outlook on mysteries, but didn't add that much to the actual plot, and that's sort of the point. He's not supposed to. And Christie succeeds with Mr. Treves in doing what she wanted him to do and nothing else. I sort of wish he survived to the end, but alas, that was not meant to be. I think he would have enjoyed the resolution, just seeing all of his philosophy come together. He misses out on what he wanted to see, basically. And I think the fact that he gets cut from a lot of the adaptations of this novel is a big indication of his superfluity to the plot, because none of the adaptations really get into this philosophy mystery novels and stuff. But again, I thought he was fine. I mean, not good, not bad, just fine. Let's talk about Audrey Strange. She recently made my top 30 one-time regular characters. She's fantastic. She's very like Neville in some regards. She too has this meeker exterior, but is very headstrong and heartstrong inwardly. She dumped Neville for Adrian Royde and let everyone think she left Neville out of kindness so he could marry Kay. And she's the only person in this book who knows the true Neville. She was afraid of Neville during her marriage. She knows what he is capable of, and after Adrian dies / is murdered, Audrey retreats into herself, and she doesn't ever come out of that shell until Angus MacWhirter helps her. I think she is expertly depicted. She feels very real, and although most of the characters in this novel feel real, she feels the most real. Now, her emotional roller coaster is very pronounced, and the reader feels like they're on this journey with her. And she's very pleasant, and we're rooting for her. Now, I think you could argue some moments of hers are a little melodramatic, she twice tries to throw herself off a cliff or contemplates doing so, but that's just such a small part of her role in the novel. It doesn't take away from her character at all. Kay Strange is again a very strong character. She too is depicted outwardly one way, but in the total opposite way inwardly. She presents herself as sort of a ditz and aloof, but she's very astute at what's going on, and mostly she does this because she thinks, quite correctly, that Neville has a big ego and he needs to be the alpha all the time. She lies about the first meeting, which was entirely planned on her part, but she lets Neville think it was fate. And Kay has a pretty good read on Neville, minus the whole evil killer stuff. The novel implies she will wind up with Ted Latimer, which is a much better, more suitable pairing for her. Unfortunately, we don't get her reaction to Neville being the murderer, and there isn't any sympathy thrown towards her in that regards. But there is sympathy thrown at her in other ways. I think most readers feel for her. She's not well liked by anyone in the story except for Ted Latimer. She's basically the social outcast. Lady Tressilian doesn't like her. Audrey's sort of indifferent. Society looks at her as like the other woman, and she's always finding herself in really like unpleasant situations she doesn't want to be in. She's being used by Neville essentially as an emotional crutch for his ego and as a tool in his murder/revenge plot. It's not clear, but I would say Neville does hold some affection for Kay. He goes to great lengths to keep her from being implicated in any way and also defends her a lot. Again, I think this is probably ego-driven on Neville's part, but still, and Christie does a lot of interesting character work with Kay, and I struggle to think of like another character in a Christie work like her. I mean, there are some that are similar, but none really in the way she's depicted. Ted Latimer is a character we don't see a lot, but his presence is always apparent. He gets mentioned a lot more than he's seen on the page. And I wish he had something of an obvious murder to murder Lady Tressilian, because he is in the optimal position to be the murderer. I guess we're supposed to believe that he framed Neville so Neville would get arrested and he could have Kay, but I mean, by that point, Kay seemed pretty detached from Neville anyway. If you watch my video on how to solve a murder mystery, one of the meta clues I give is that the murderer is an outsider to the main social structure. Ted Latimer does not stay at Ghost Point. He is out of the main social dynamics. And while Kay is something of a social outcast, she is technically part of the social dynamic. Ted Latimer is not. And he does have a connection to Kay, but to no one else. And he's not in that main group, and that makes him ideal, especially in this case where the murderer had to come from the outside. Now, Christie tricks us by having the murderer be an insider coming from outside, which she normally doesn't do. And Ted also has one of the more obvious, unusual physical features in his misshaped skull. And Ted does appear to be high on Battle's radar for much of the story, but his lack of motive really took him out of contention for me. He also couldn't have murdered Mr. Treves, and we learned that pretty early on because he walked Mr. Treves home to the hotel, so he couldn't have hung the sign on the door of the elevator. But Ted Latimer was a fun character. He's very likable. I don't necessarily think he stands out in like the grand Christie verse, but he was good. I've always liked the end where Battle pushes him into the sea to make sure he can't swim and he has to be rescued from drowning by the police. Thomas Royde is a character in the same vein as Ted Latimer, the likable but not remarkable young man who just seems like an overall nice guy. I think Thomas Royde has a little bit more seriousness to him than Ted Latimer does, whereas Ted is pretty confident he will get Kay in the end. Thomas is more reserved toward Audrey. He wants Audrey, but he's not so aggressive in pursuing her. Instead, he gets pursued himself by Mary Aldin, with the implication that they will be a couple. A bit odd, as we never really get his opinion of Mary, but as Audrey says, Thomas just doesn't know he likes Mary yet, but he'll figure it out soon enough. And Thomas is a lot more emotional than Ted. He's still angry about his brother's death and losing Audrey, but he is more mature in handling his feelings. In terms of being a suspect, he is high on the list. Again, he's in that odd space of like being an outsider, but not a true outsider. He pops up suddenly at Mr. Treves' hotel when the sign was posted. And I remember when I first read this book thinking that was odd. And he was my initial suspect the very first time I read this because of that. But it was not to be. Christie tricked me once again. And I think we're supposed to believe he killed Lady Tressilian to frame Neville so he could get Audrey back, but I just don't know why he would do that. Audrey was already divorced from him and unattached to anyone else. I liked Thomas Royde. I liked every character in this book, and he was no exception. Mary Aldin is in a character trope we see a lot in Christie, that poor relation stuck taking care of like the wealthy, invalided elder relative. I think Mary is more vibrant and unique than these characters tend to be. She's not so much like mooning about the place, and she's appreciated by Lady Tressilian. She also seems to be more on equal footing with the other characters than with the servants. Sometimes these people are like quasi-servants that don't really fit in with everyone else, but that's not Mary Aldin. And she's not resentful at all of her situation. She appreciates that she can live at Gull's Point and really not be bothered by the outside world. And yeah, she doesn't have any money and she does want more, but she's not upset at her position by any means. She's never really treated like a suspect in universe, but she does inherit, and we know small inheritances even are worth keeping an eye on. Is also in that perfect position to set up the scene in a way a murderer usually needs to be, to make sure like everything goes smoothly according to plan. Now Neville essentially takes that away from her so he can set things up in his own way. So that's a bit of a red herring, and I do think Mary Aldin would have been like an unsatisfying murderer. She just didn't seem it at all, and I wouldn't have believed that like she is really this insane mad woman like Neville is, and when he breaks down. And the final character to discuss here is Angus MacWhirter. I found him a bit irritating, to be honest, but never to the point where I didn't like him or I thought he was unnecessary or that he was harming the book. I like how Christie takes his sad story and turns it around into something positive, and it never gets over inspirational. And what I mean by that is she doesn't harp on this sad story and like rising from the ashes to overcome tragedy. He tries to commit suicide, gets stuck in a tree, and then moves on to better pastures. MacWhirter is really the person who solves the crime. Not that he pinpoints Neville Strange, but he is the one who figures out all the stuff with like the ropes and all that. Battle never would have gotten there on his own. And I think this is a bit of a missed opportunity here. Not that it's a problem, but Toward Zero is a book heavily focused on the characters, like Sad Cypress and Five Little Pigs. The human nature aspects are so important and crucial. It's part of the cluing. And to have Angus MacWhirter solve it is a bit of a miss because he never met like most of these people. He does not interact at all with some of them, and the others only for a very short bit of time. He doesn't know the characters. He does fulfill the nurse's prediction that he would be needed in the future to save someone, that someone being Audrey, and I liked that about him. I thought that was a good story, and I don't think like we get a lot of that in mystery fiction at all. To be honest, he's a little Mr. Quinn coded in that way, who sort of came out of nowhere, saved someone, and then disappeared just as quickly as he came in. But again, a little more grounded than Mr. Quinn, I would say. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think about Toward Zero in the comments below. There is an upcoming BBC adaptation of Toward Zero starring Angelica Houston as Lady Tressilian that I have high hopes for, but I've been disappointed with some of these Christie adaptations lately, especially coming from the BBC. But we'll see. Next week, I begin my two-part video ranking of every Nero Wolfe novel written by Rex Stout. You all voted for Nero Wolfe a long time ago, and I finally finished my rereads, and I am ready to rank them. Next week will be the bottom half, so stay tuned for that. Josephine Tey already won the next poll to be the next author, but you can vote for the author after that. The poll is still open until I finish my rereads of Josephine Tey, or I should say my reads of Josephine Tey. I have not read all of these books before. I've only read The Daughter of Time and I think like one or two others, so some of these are brand new for me, so I'll be interested in giving my thoughts on those later on. Until next time, Mystery Files.